parable of the mustard seed appears in Matthew 13:31-32, Mark 4:30-32, and Luke 13:18-19. It is a short yet powerful illustration Jesus used to describe the kingdom of God. Understanding the parable in Jesus' time. In this parable, Jesus compares the kingdom of God to a mustard seed, saying, "It is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest of all seeds on earth. Yet when planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all garden plants, with such big branches that the birds can perch in its shade." Mark 4:31-32, how Jesus used the mustard seed to connect with people relating to everyday life. Jesus often used agricultural imagery because most of his audience were farmers or laborers who understood planting and growth. The mustard seed, though tiny, was known for its rapid and expansive growth, a message of hope. To the Jews at the time, the idea that God's kingdom would start small but grow immensely was encouraging. Many expected a grand, powerful kingdom to overthrow Roman rule. But Jesus taught that God's work often begins humbly before flourishing. Inclusivity. The mention of birds finding shelter represents Gentiles and all nations being welcomed into God's kingdom. This was a radical idea for many Jews who thought the Messiah would come only for Israel, applying the parable today. Just like in Jesus' time, the message of the mustard seed remains relevant in our modern world. Faith starts small. In our personal lives, faith might start as a small belief, but as we nurture it with prayer, learning, and trust in God, it grows into something strong and unshakable. Matthew 17:20, small acts lead to great impact. In a world obsessed with instant success, this parable reminds us that even small, faithful actions, kindness, generosity, sharing God's love, can have huge, lasting effects over time. The growth of God's kingdom today, the church began with Jesus and a handful of disciples. Today, Christianity has spread across the world, proving that God's kingdom is still growing just as Jesus predicted. How we can connect with this parable: plant mustard seeds of kindness and faith in our communities. Even small gestures can inspire and uplift others. Trust in the growth process. Even when we don't see immediate results, God is working behind the scenes. Include and welcome others. The kingdom of God is for everyone, and we are called to share the gospel with all people. This parable is a timeless reminder that great things start small, whether in faith, in personal growth, or in spreading God's love. Just as Jesus used the mustard seed to connect with his audience, we can use it today to encourage patience, perseverance, and trust in God's plan. The parable of the mustard seed, a call to God's kingdom and his ways. Matthew 13:31-32, Mark 4:30-32, Luke 13:18-19. Jesus used the parable of the mustard seed to describe the growth of God's kingdom. He said, "It is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches." Matthew 13:31-32, what the mustard seed meant in Jesus' time. During Jesus' time, many people believed that only Israel had access to God's promises because they had the Torah, God's instructions and commandments. However, this parable revealed a greater truth. God's kingdom would start small, but it would grow to include all who embraced his laws and his ways, even those who were once far from him. Gentiles, those without the Torah in the first century, Gentiles referred to those who were outside of Israel and did not follow God's Torah. They lived in pagan traditions, worshipped false gods, and were not part of God's covenant. But Jesus taught that many Gentiles would come into the kingdom, just as the prophets foretold. Many nations shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." Micah 4:2. Thus, the mustard seed represents not just the spread of God's kingdom, but the process of people turning away from paganism and coming into the knowledge of God's laws. The meaning of the mustard seed today, just as in Jesus' time, this parable has deep meaning for us today. Accepting God's ways, rejecting pagan practices. The kingdom of God grows when people accept his commandments, such as keeping Passover instead of Easter and the Feast of Tabernacles instead of Christmas, returning to the ways he originally commanded in the Torah, leaving man-made traditions. Just as early believers had to reject idolatry and false worship, many today are coming out of Sunday church traditions and returning to the biblical Sabbath and holy days set by God. This is part of the growth of the mustard seed, as more people awaken to the truth of God's commands. The birds finding rest. The birds in the parable symbolize the Gentiles who come into the faith and find shelter in the ways of God. They are no longer outsiders, but now part of God's people, grafted into the covenant. Romans 11:17-19. How we can apply this today: plant mustard seeds of truth by sharing God's instructions with others. Encourage people to leave false traditions and return to God's biblical feasts and Sabbath. Recognize that God's kingdom is growing. More people are waking up and seeking to follow his ways as he originally intended. Conclusion: the mustard seed parable teaches that God's kingdom starts small but grows as more people embrace his laws and reject false traditions. It is not just about faith, it is about obedience, transformation, and restoration to God's original plan. Those who once lived without the Torah now have the opportunity to come in, just as the prophets and Jesus himself taught. Just as Jesus used this parable to connect with his audience, today it calls us to reject man-made traditions and return to God's instructions so that we too may be part of his growing kingdom.